Hey, hello everyone, and welcome to another NCHE webinar. I'm Kathleen Barker with NCHE, here with my colleagues Shauna Liverati and Rob Good. And we are very excited tonight to introduce you to Dr. Christina Snyder, who will be talking with us about the Jacksonian era. And Dr. Snyder is the McCabe Greer Professor of the American Civil War Era at the Pennsylvania State University. And as we were discussing with her earlier, she is an historian of colonialism, race, and slavery, but she focuses on North America essentially from the pre-colonial era through the late 19th century. So she will be talking with us tonight about the 19th century, and she will be drawing from a couple of her own research experiences and writings. She is the author of Great Crossings, Indian Settlers and Slaves in the Age of Jackson, which is where we drew our title from this evening. And then Slavery in Indian Country, The Changing Face of Captivity in Early America. So, Dr. Snyder, we are very pleased to have you here. Folks, as you are listening tonight, please feel free to add your questions to chat, and we will have some time to discuss further after the presentation. So take it away, Dr. Snyder.
Thank you, Kathleen. Thanks for inviting me and arranging this. It's a pleasure to be with you all tonight. Thanks for coming. I am going to talk primarily about my latest book, Great Crossings, but I'll be happy to talk about any of the themes that Kathleen brought up in her introduction. So I plan to talk for about 40 to 45 minutes about antebellum America, and especially about education among Native Americans and African Americans during that period. So I will start my PowerPoint here. And after my talk, I'll be happy to do Q&A for about 15 or 20 minutes. So I look forward to that. Thank you so much. Okay, so hopefully you're all seeing my screen share now. This is my most recent book, and this is a book that retells the story of Jacksonian America by looking at an experimental community called Great Crossings. So in a sense, this is really a micro-history of a community that tries to look more broadly at the ways in which North America was transformed during the Jacksonian period. Great Crossings got its name the previous century when bison habitually crossed Elkhorn Creek, which you can see here at this shallow spot. Great Crossings is in the bluegrass region of Kentucky. If you've been to that area, it is basically in between Frankfort and Lexington. Now, by the time of my story, the 19th century, the bison had disappeared, but Great Crossings had become a different kind of meeting ground, home to a famous interracial family, and the first federal indigenous school controlled by the federal government rather than a missionary society. And in this book, I argue that the story of this community reflects in microcosm the large-scale forces shaping North America between the War of 1812 and the Civil War. But this place itself was famous in its day, and it animated some of those changes, profoundly impacting those involved and influencing national policies in the United States and in Indian country. So the reason that this community in particular intrigued me is that so often the story of Jacksonian America focuses on whites who turned west to conquer a continent. And this story instead begins in the interior of the continent and looks outward to reorient our perspective and broaden our gaze. It includes American Indian people who faced east and tried to meet Americans in the middle, and African Americans who challenged the Empire of Liberty to live up to its rhetoric. So the thing that really made Great Crossings famous in its day was the fact that it was home to this Native American boarding school. And this map shows you where Great Crossings is in Kentucky. And it also shows you the tribal nations who sent children to this school. over the course of the lifetime of this school, which lasted from 1825 to 1848, it educated nearly 700 Indigenous boys and men representing 17 different tribal nations. And you can see that variety here. They came from across the continent. One thing that I'll say now is that this was a male-only school, and I can talk to you more about why that is if you want to in the Q&A. But one thing to note is that these are incredibly diverse Indigenous people who are often meeting each other for the first time. And so I want to share some of their stories of how they arrived at Great Crossings. One of the peoples who came early on were Quapaws, whose nation controlled the Arkansas River Valley where the South met the plains. And they arrived at the gates of the school with a trunk and 4 blankets. Only one of the Quapaw boys could speak a little English, though he could not explain how they had gotten there, quote, except that they came in a steamboat. A group of Choctaw teenagers, originally from what's now Mississippi, spoke no English, but they managed to complete their month-long journey aided by their wits and a note written by some of their literate countrymen, quote, to the public. This is what the note says. As they have no supervisor and understand very little of the English language and have very imperfect and limited knowledge of the world, it is hoped that the good people on the road will aid them and will not allow them to drink any spirits. 8 Seminole boys, originally from what's now Florida, were educated by an African-American translator named Jim Walker, who worked for a Seminole chief. Before leaving, Walker bribed Choctaw Academy's head cook to give the chief's son extra generous portions. William Lewis, a young Osage boy originally from the Missouri Valley, probably spoke better French than English when he arrived at the school. The most well-traveled member of the student body, Lewis was part of an Osage delegation that had just spent 3 years in France, where he met King Charles X, attended the theater, and rode in a hot air balloon. So what brought all of these boys and young men to this school? So unlike boarding schools of the later 19th century, this one was voluntary. Tribes themselves contracted with the federal government and paid for tuition and fees out of their national coffers. Why did they do so? Come back to this. So in that era, the United States actually conquered few Indigenous nations on the battlefield. As Native leaders knew, most of their land had been usurped in treaties demanded by an ever-growing number of invading white settlers. These treaties were written in a foreign language through imperfect and usually corrupt translators. As the United States had become increasingly aggressive in its ambitions, Native people desperately wanted new solutions for peaceful cohabitation, including more effective mediators. Potawatomi Chief Noonday explained the appeal of the school. I wish our children to be instructed like the whites. Then these educated people will become capable of assisting us in the transaction of business with white people. So in short, Native nations wanted more than what the few American schools in their own nations, which were mission schools, offered. Mission schools were largely focused on conversion and vocational education. And what this school, Choctaw Academy, advertised was an elite education. Most of those who attended the school, especially early on, were the sons or nephews of political and economic leaders. Now, something to note is that what the forces that brought about this academy in the first place. So Great Crossings was in Kentucky for a reason. It was originally operated on the plantation of Richard Mentor Johnson. So Richard Mentor Johnson was a lifelong politician. He was a famous Democrat. In his day, he was second only to fame to Andrew Jackson. And he basically used Indian affairs throughout the course of his career to enhance his prospects. So what you may already know about Richard Mentor Johnson is that he claimed to have killed Tecumseh at the Battle of the Thames. A generation later, he proposed to, quote, civilize the indigenous children of the tribes that he had fought with as what was part of the civilization program at that time, the dominant US Indian policy. Richard Mentor Johnson is fascinating. He has a long congressional record. I'm going to just talk a little bit more about some of his private reasons for founding the school on his property. So he said from the very beginning that one of the reasons why he wanted to found a school on his property was to educate his daughters. So another reason that Johnson is somewhat famous is that he had a long-term enslaved African-American partner named Julia Chin. And it doesn't seem that he ever emancipated Julia Chin. She died in 1833, and records from a few years before her death indicate that she was still enslaved. So it doesn't necessarily seem that he emancipated her during his lifetime. But they had two children together, Imogene, who you see here, and another daughter, Adeline. And he did emancipate both of those daughters and vest them with significant property holdings. This was pretty unusual for white fathers of mixed race children at the time, but it does seem to be part of Richard Mentor Johnson's long-term vision for his family. So he wanted to have access to education for his children. He also educated or had educated some of their cousins who were also enslaved on the plantation. So in total, about 60 enslaved people worked at Great Crossings. About 12 of them worked directly for the school, cooking, cleaning, serving meals, doing laundry, mending. Johnson paid the headmaster of Choctaw Academy, Thomas Henderson, who is an abolitionist, and underneath the table portion of Choctaw funds to educate his daughters at night and on the weekends. And education at that time was a major avenue for enhanced opportunity among people of African descent. Education for enslaved or free African Americans was never made illegal in Kentucky, as it was in some other southern states, but there were very few educational avenues open for people of African descent in Kentucky. So it's clear that, you know, the entire time Johnson wanted to have this institution on his property. There are lots of pictures of Richard Mentor Johnson. I'm including this one in particular, which is a miniature that would have been worn as a locket because this one was actually passed down to his daughter Imogene and kept in her family for generations. And some of the research that I did for this book was with that family of descendants who told me more about the material culture and the oral history of the family. And I'm happy to talk a bit more about that later. One of the things that is really exciting about doing this project is because it is focused on antebellum education. Many of the people associated with Great Crossings, including many people of color, became and remained active writers because of the education they had. So the documentary record is especially rich for understanding the lives of antebellum people of color. So that's pretty unusual during this time period to have a pretty large documentary record for Native people and to a lesser extent, people of African descent. We do know that Julia Chin, Johnson's long-term partner who is enslaved, she was literate. But it seems that after Richard Mentor Johnson's death, his family purposely destroyed her letters in an effort to disinherit their daughters. And obviously, as a historian, this makes telling the story much more difficult. But there's more that we can piece together, including in many of Richard's letters. He does quote from Julia's letters to talk about things that are happening on the plantation. He also expected for Julia Chin to act as his proxy while he was gone. So, at that time, Congress was in session about 6 months out of the year, every year. And in that time, Julia Chen was supposed to act as his proxy on the estate, including at the school. So she has pretty wide authority. She's frequently mentioned. So this is very much a place that brought America's diverse people together. One of the, and here actually is another important letter where Johnson is talking specifically about educating his daughters as a priority for the schoolmaster of the Indigenous school. So really the turning point in this story is the 1830s are a time of tremendous change. And the watershed moment in terms of the history of Choctaw Academy is Andrew Jackson's Indian Removal Act of 1830, which also paves the way for the expansion of slavery. So the Trail of Tears paved the way for this kind of parallel African-American experience in which nearly 1 million enslaved people were sold down the river to the notoriously harsh expanding cotton frontier. And this is a map. I like these are older maps which show settlement of the United States over time. So this is a map from 1820, and it shows the extent of settlement by US citizens. That's when the academy is founded in the 1820s. By the 1850s, that has obviously expanded dramatically. So Kentucky, when the school is founded, is really, quote, the West. And by the time we come around to the end of the story, California is the West. So it's really this time of incredible change where the diverse people who are coming together to think about education, which is really a way of obviously preparing future generations for what they're going to encounter. There's a lot of change in the period, and there are battles at the school about what the meaning and purpose of Indigenous education is. The school is founded with this kind of idea that Native Americans will be quote unquote civilized and will eventually become citizens of the United States. A decade later, the federal government's view had changed significantly. There was no pretense that Native people were going to become citizens. Andrew Jackson had pushed this policy of Indigenous separation and removal. And many people in the Jackson administration questioned the utility and purpose of schools for Indigenous people. And the Native students there also reported that the quality of the curriculum changed over time. So initially, this is supposed to be an elite school where students are advancing through subjects, going from the basics, spelling, reading, writing, to intermediate subjects like grammar, geography, history, surveying, and algebra. The most advanced students took moral philosophy, astronomy, Latin, and classical history. And some of them actually went on to professional school, to law school or medical school in the United States. So, in most ways, the curriculum of the academy is very, very similar to that of other American academies. And some of the students do really become prominent intellectuals, certainly in their own communities. And many of them gain admission to these more advanced places of education in the US too, which I'm happy to talk about. But what the students report is that the quality of the curriculum changes, that they question the amount of money that their own nations are spending to support student enrollment at these schools. There are lots of acts of rebellion at the school, running away, burning down buildings. In the most famous example of student resistance at school, there's an Indigenous teacher, John Jones, a student, and two enslaved Black women who are cousins of Imogene and Adeline, who all flee to Canada. So Jones, before he turned rebel, before he took flight with these enslaved women, was one of the Academy's most accomplished scholars. He went to law school. He spoke French, English, Odawa, Potawatomi, and his native Ojibwe. And he knew that 2 years earlier, in 1833, Canada had abolished slavery. And Canada at that time was also a beacon of freedom for Native Americans during this period. Some Native people of the Great Lakes region sought refuge in Canada during the Trail of Tears as a kind of alternative to forced removal to the West. And so it seems likely that what these Native men and Black women reasoned that it was better to seek their fate in Canada rather than continue a life of enslavement or an unknown future in the West. So part of what is interesting about this story is the connections that the diverse people of Choctaw Academy made in this period. And one has to imagine the kinds of stories that they shared about prejudices and policies in the US and the places that they looked to find a measure of liberation. So when this policy of Indian removal was formed, Jacksonian Democrats drew on this emerging scientific racism to form this powerful and enduring ideology that, sought to exclude Native people from America's future, claiming that, they could not be modern, that they were not a people of change, not a people fit for the future. And interestingly, a lot of Native people doubled down on literacy and education as a means to defend their rights and to participate in a kind of global exchange of ideas. So at this time, as Native people were facing forced removal in the 1830s and 1840s, there's one figure more than anybody else who was responsible for taking charge of Choctaw Academy and redirecting the ways that Indigenous nations spent their education funds. And that person was Peter Pitchlynn. He's a Choctaw leader. He later became a chief during the Civil War. He had been a student at Choctaw Academy. And over time, he became one of the Academy's most powerful critics. So he really carefully noticed the decline of subject matter and curriculum. And what he wanted to do was to withdraw Choctaw funds, and he encouraged other Native nations to do the same. And his idea was to found their own public school systems in Indian Territory. And so that's exactly what he did. Pitchlynn worked through his diplomatic channels to become appointed the new superintendent of Choctaw Academy, and he over time worked to close it and to seize control of tribal funds to redirect them to new Indigenous schools in Indian Territory. And what the Choctaws created was really interesting. Here's a map, by the way, of Indian Territory circa 1840. So these were the tribal nations who were forced to Indian Territory. As you can see, in 1840, it's much larger than the space that it eventually became in the later 19th century. But already by 1840, we see all these diverse nations who are being forced to live in much closer quarters than ever before. And many of them had been students at Choctaw Academy. So one thing to note is that one thing that forges intertribal ties and activism is this shared experience of schooling. One of the reasons I became interested in the school is because so many chiefs from the mid to late 19th century had attended this school. And so I became curious about their experiences there. And Choctaws are really at the vanguard of creating a public school system in Indian Territory. They were the first ones to really put it into action. The Cherokees were very close in there as well, and many of the other Native nations that you see depicted here. But I'm just going to talk for a bit about the Choctaws because they kind of took the lead in this movement. And one of the things that I discovered when I was looking at this pivot to tribally created school systems is that Native nations weren't merely imitating their American neighbors, but instead they were positioning themselves at the vanguard of a broader movement that sought to democratize access to education. So by the time that the Choctaws created their public school system in 1842, only 3 states in the United States, those were Massachusetts, Delaware, and Pennsylvania, had established free public schools before the Choctaws. So this was really a new idea in the United States. And when Peter Pitchlynn was studying different educational movements, he studied the reforms of Horace Mann in Massachusetts, but he ultimately took a more global view. He looked at the example of Prussia, which at the time was this progressive educational space where the law dictated that all children must attend school and that parents could be fined for failing to send their children to school or even jailed. And eventually, actually, Pitchlynn did put this stipulation into effect where parents were fined for not sending their children to school. So, as the Choctaws are forming their school system, foreign educators and missionaries watched this experiment with interest. And some predicted that the Choctaws would, quote, soon vie with the most enlightened nations on our globe. So I'm going to talk just briefly about the new school system in Indian Territory. So there was really a 3-tiered system of public schools created by the Choctaws, which become pretty common among some of the other tribal nations of Indian Territory. The kind of lowest threshold are what are called weekend schools for people who worked during the week. So that might be children, but more often it was adults. So there is a kind of adult education program. The second level of schools were neighborhood schools. So that was kind of more primary education focus for local children. And then at the top level were the academies. And you see the first Choctaw school established in Indian Territory. It's seen much later here in the 1880s. But those are kind of the top tier schools, which tend to be residential simply because travel was so difficult. But those are schools with more elite curricula and more advanced learning. So in line with this, there are some very specific corrections that Choctaws and other Indigenous people wanted to make from what they had experienced at Choctaw Academy. So that included things like bilingualism. English was the only official language of instruction at Choctaw Academy. We know that some kind of tutoring and group learning happened there, but again, English was the only official language of instruction, which remained a constant stumbling block, especially for older students. but there's bilingualism in these school systems. And one thing that you'll note, maybe based on the picture here, is that co-education is also an important part of schooling in Indian Territory. And that's one thing that tribal leaders felt that they had made a mistake with before, was not expending equal money for the education of women and girls. So by the 1850s, there are roughly equal money spent on men's and women's academies, and co-education exists all the way down through the three-tiered school system. Now, to go along with this expansion of the school system, there is this kind of golden age of indigenous language printing, because of course you need texts to teach in these schools, and you have many more readers. So printed material is circulating at a much greater rate. So in the mid-19th centuries, the Choctaw Nation in particular produced 11 million pages of print, including many textbooks that catered specifically to these new schools. At first, these books were published in US cities like Boston and Cincinnati, but by the 1840s, the Choctaws, Cherokees, and Shawnees all had their own printing presses, some of which were printed in several additional indigenous languages for neighboring tribes. And something that is also interesting to note is this school system that was developed, especially by the Choctaws and Cherokees, was markedly better than what these other frontier states surrounding these native nations offered. So places like Arkansas or later on Oklahoma Territory. So sometimes white families actually tried to send their children to these native schools because they were recognized as being of very high quality. And native nations, didn't necessarily want to educate non-citizens, but at the same time, they were reluctant to turn away the dozens of white children who kept turning up at their schools. So they developed a policy. Non-citizens could attend indigenous school, but they usually had to pay a small fee for tuition and books, which was about $1 a month. So these native schools of Indian Territory proliferated. Native nations put a lot of their national wealth, which had often been gained through treaty annuities, into these schools. And they really persisted until the federal takeover following the Curtis Act. The federal takeover took place in 1898, and it authorized the Interior Department of the United States to seize 995 tribally controlled schools in Indian Territory. So at that time, there were almost 1,000 tribally controlled schools. Now, at that time, many Native students persisted in their pursuit of higher education, but this takeover by the state and federal governments overwhelmingly benefited whites. Some tribal schools became federal Indian boarding schools. Wheelock, for example, became a federal Indian boarding school. And the rest were controlled by Oklahoma, which used former indigenous schools as the building blocks of its segregated public school system. The quality of indigenous education also suffered as the schools passed out of tribal control. The curriculum shrank from 12 to 8 grades. School was in session 9 instead of 10 months a year. And students, rather than staff, did the custodial work, the cleaning, and the maintenance. A study of the Choctaw and Cherokee nations found that literacy rates reached a high of nearly 100% under their tribal school system in the late 19th century, which was actually 13% higher than the US national average. But that plummeted after the US takeover, registering only 60% in 1969. So for the tribal nations who had worked so hard to create and administer their own educational institutions, the theft of their school systems were national tragedies, staggering loss of capital and autonomy. There were lots of outcomes of Native people's schooling experiences, both at Choctaw Academy and tribal schools. And one of the things that I did in the later portion of the book was to trace people's lives who came out of Choctaw Academy or were affiliated with Choctaw Academy in some way. And one of the things that came out of that experience was the seeds of global anti-colonial activism. So one of the trends in the field of Native studies is um, seeing global connections among Indigenous experiences across continents. And I think that actually the anti-removal activism that emerged in the antebellum period and the expansion of literacy and print media is a key moment in this global anti-colonial struggle where people start to communicate with one another and to share ideas. So at Great Crossings, students for the first time are meeting other Native nations from across the continent, and this offers them a kind of continental experience on US expansion. But then their coursework expands this even farther, introducing them to distant allies who they might only encounter in print. And one thing that really interested me, and I have lots of examples of the students' assignments from the school also, or their later writings as well. And the fellow colonized people that are most frequently mentioned by Choctaw Academy students and graduates were the Irish, which may seem kind of surprising at first. Although if you actually look at their textbooks, there are lots of mentions of the Irish as kind of the prototypical resistant colonized people. So for example, one of their textbook readings probably, was seeking to criticize the Irish, but probably delighted the native students. The passage said, after 700 years of either nominal or real domination, England has been unable to Anglicize Ireland. And these kind of connections, I think that students thought about during their days as scholars, those grew later on. So for example, Peter Pitchlynn was inspired by an Irish politician named Daniel O'Connell, who, by the way, was also a major inspiration for Frederick Douglass. In his day, O'Connell was known as the Liberator, and he successfully pushed through many reforms that empowered Irish Catholics. He gave stirring speeches in the Irish House of Commons, some of which were later circulated throughout the world. And so here is an example of an O'Connell speech that Pitchlynn copied into his diary while he was serving as a diplomat in Washington, D.C. So this is a part of a speech, quote, on bigotry. She has no head and cannot think, no heart and cannot feel. When she moves, it is in wrath. When she pauses, it is amid ruin. Her prayers are curses. Her God is a demon. Her decalogue written in the blood of her victims. And when Pitchlynn copied those lines into his journal in 1846, the United States had dispossessed nearly 90% of Eastern Native people of their homelands, and then had set about extending its empire west through the conquest of Mexican possessions. At the same time, the Irish potato famine struck, killing 1 million people and driving 2 million people to emigrate. And Native nations gave very generously to the victims of the potato famine, even as they're recovering from their own trail of tears. So Muskogee Creeks donated 100,000 barrels of corn, and Choctaws collected $710. Now, while American newspapers cited the influence of whites, especially missionaries, it seems more likely that Indigenous people had their own motivations. So in recent decades, the Irish have reciprocated this idea of generosity and recognition. They have retraced the Trail of Tears alongside Choctaw people and erected a monument in County Cork in memory of the Choctaw donation called Kindred Spirits. So I'm going to wrap up here and just throw out some of the concluding thoughts about this book. So, in many ways, this is a book about paths not taken. It's about contingency. When we look back at history, sometimes students approach history with the sense of inevitability, like, oh, of course, this is going to happen. But I really like to emphasize contingency to my students because none of us know what is going to happen at any moment. And it drives humans crazy. We never know what the future holds. And so I think that paths not taken are worth exploring. And I think that the students at Choctaw Academy had some interesting ideas about time and about thinking about education as a way to plan for their own future. So, in their essays, they wrote about history, but they talked about time not as linear, not as a linear progression, but more like a reoccurring sine wave moving up and down, repeating its cycles. And I think that this indigenous model of time can help frame American history in a new light. So, Americans prize the seeds of virtue sown by the revolutionary generation, but the Jacksonian period really foregrounds the deeds of violence that nourished the nation as it became strong and powerful. But I think, as long as we continue to cultivate amnesia about unpleasant historical truths, we'll continue to reap the legacies of the Jacksonian era. I think that there are these two impulses that you see in American history during the first generations. One is toward democratization, inclusion, expansion of opportunity, and the other is about exclusion based on race, ethnicity, gender. And I think this idea of reoccurring time or circular time can help us to circle back to earlier movements, moments, and help provide an opportunity to cultivate change. So, as we think about the promise of liberty, I think about the ways in which the people of Choctaw Academy pushed the United States to extend rights of citizenship or respect the autonomies promised in treaty. So I'll just conclude it there, and I'll be happy to take any of your questions now.
Right, thank you. Thank you. So now is your chance. Please, folks, feel free to add your questions to the Q&A function. Let us know if you have some thoughts. I think one question I've been thinking about is one that you mentioned early on, which is why initially the school was not co-ed, why it was just boys.
Yeah, so this is something that is discussed in the correspondence. And Richard Mentor Johnson actually floated the idea of making the school co-ed to Native nations. And I think mostly because he was always eager to make more money. But the tribal nations, I think, had some concern about sending women so far away from home. They had Choctaws in particular had issues with sexual abuse among missionaries, and they worried that they would have even less control over teachers, far away out of their nations. The other factor that I think is at play here is that, when they looked at Choctaw Academy, which is supposed to have this more elite education, they thought that these kind of roles that the school was preparing people for, things like being a merchant or a politician or a lawyer, that those were the roles that men were going to take on. So that was the initial thinking. Although, 20 years later, when they circle back and start thinking about their public schools, it's interesting to see the leaders say that they had made a mistake in that regard. And they provided funds for women's education, including set aside funds every year for women who wanted to attend college in the United States.
It's a fascinating mix of some very practical concerns, right? Interesting. So we have a couple of questions. So one from Tiffany, why do you think the quality of instruction declined over time? Was it a result of the impending state or federal takeover of Native schools?
I think it was because the changing US Indian policy at that time. So there is this shift, um, you know, within the first 10 years of the school when the federal government shifts its policy from civilization, which is supposed to be about assimilation. It's still about taking indigenous land, but the idea is it has this kind of more environmentally focused theory of race where the idea was like uplift through education and culture. Essentially the idea that humans are not that biologically different. But Jackson's administration brings in this more hardline scientific racism, what we might think of as like a biological argument, to argue that it was impossible for Native people to reach the intellect of whites. So anyway, I think it's really the federal policy there that changes the way that school administrators are thinking about the curriculum.
Unmute, sorry. Uh, so from Duncan, a question about thinking forward a bit. Where do you see the future of Native American relations with the US concerning land recapture or treaty enforcement?
Ooh, um, I mean, I think this is another thing about contingency. You never exactly know what the future holds. But I do think there have been a lot of promising developments in the 20th century and 21st centuries. So there are means now for Native nations to essentially reconstitute reservations by like acquiring new parcels of land and holding them in trust. So, a lot of um, the land loss of the 19th century, it's, we're nowhere near those kind of levels of Native land ownership, but there is this process now, which has been really positive for a lot of tribal nations. And there are other kinds of initiatives that tribes have taken to promote economic development and really assert sovereignty. So, things like gaming, developing tribal health and education initiatives. Um, I think that there has been a lot to celebrate in the last, really since the Indian New Deal in some ways. But it's an ongoing battle, and I think the scary thing is that part of such a large measure of what happens with Indian affairs depends on the will of the vast majority of Americans who are not indigenous. So there's kind of this tyranny of the majority issue because Congress still has plenary power over Native nations, which means it can act unilaterally if it wants to. So I guess I take encouragement from things like recent Supreme Court rulings about Native people having jurisdiction over crimes in their own territories. And, hopefully the United States will continue to respect, those promises that are made in treaties and that are really fundamental to laws that date back from the early republic. But again, it is difficult to peer into the future.
Excellent. And Kim added a great point in chat, just that many tribes are purchasing land as well, so that there isn't that issue of land held in trust, but they actually land, right? So thank you, Kim. Let's see. So we had another great question in reference to something that you mentioned, that Native Americans, some chose to move to Canada. So were Indigenous people educated better there, or were they treated better? What was that situation kind of in comparison?
So I actually not as sure about the education question. So that would be interesting for a Canadian expert to ask. But one thing that is definitely true about Anishinaabe people in this period, who are this loose confederation of Native peoples of the Great Lakes, is that Anishinaabe on the Canadian side were not facing the same kinds of pressures to remove and cede land at this time as tribal nations on the US side of the border were. So I think the main thing that was attractive was the abolition of slavery, which is probably what, encouraged the Native women, the Native men and Black women to go together, but B, the kind of less surveillance and lack of forced removal at that time. I do know that John Jones remained a school teacher, that he taught in one of those bilingual schools that was developed in his nation on the Canadian side of the border at that time. So certainly he's kind of promoting that vision of bilingual Native education.
And then a question from Brianna. Does this legacy of learning still last in this area in any way that people can see today?
Oh, I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
Oh, sure. So in terms of this legacy of learning, does that still last in some of the areas you were talking about today, in any way that we can see today?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of ways in which these educational issues continue to come up. I think one is that Native people wanted to seek education, and I should note that it wasn't a universal desire during this period. There were certain tribal nations who wanted to do it. Others did not want anything to do with American schooling or Western schooling at that time. But there were Native nations who were interested in it. They wanted to do it on their own terms, though, and I think that's really the key. Is that when tribal nations created their own schools, Native people were on the board of trustees. They were in teaching roles. They were acting as superintendents of schools. They created school holidays around indigenous religious holidays. So I think that impulse of education and wanting to engage with Americans for the purposes of negotiating treaties, doing business, recognizing that Americans were here to stay, was there. But again, I think that idea of who controls education, what the purpose of education is an ongoing battle that I think you still see, alive in Native nations today. And I guess the other thing I'll mention is intertribal activism, and that some of those connections that are made in that early 1800s period. I think those guys get stronger over time, and as we can see now in the 21st century, extend in this more global indigenous movement.
All right, thank you. So another question, how were the daughters, I think the Chin daughters, able to receive their inheritance despite the family's efforts to keep the resources for themselves?
Yes. Thanks for bringing it back to them. So the short answer is that they managed to retain the resources that Richard Mentor Johnson gave them while he was still alive. And the property they have difficulty accessing was his estate after his death. So Richard's brothers basically disinherited them by arguing that those two children were illegitimate. So they do actually get quite a bit of property. Unfortunately, Adeline died. She actually died before Richard Mentor Johnson, but Imogene lived a long time, and they both had descendants, and their families still live in the area today. So some property, not as much as what the family had intended.
Amazing. So we have a kind of a clarification question from Andrew. So just to make sure that we heard this correctly, you were showing us a map of different indigenous groups in 1840. And was it because of the school that these groups were able to coexist more peacefully?
Ooh, that's a good question. The you know, the amount of students who went to the school was really relatively small. So I would say I probably the more accurate thing for me to say is that it made political leaders of those nations more willing to make alliances. So I would say it made diplomacy easier. And again, especially, many of these boys grew up to become politically influential in their own nations. So they are actively reaching out in those school ties.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so we have at this point one more question. But any suggestions on how you might structure a more inclusive class on US history during this period? Any suggestions for us?
Ooh. Yeah, so I do teach the first half of the US survey, so I try to think about this question. And I I also read a US history textbook, and we focus on the circulation of people, goods, and ideas, this kind of Atlantic world influence model of American history that puts it in a global perspective. And I think, in thinking about it, that's the way that I basically tried to do my US history survey. I mean, I think about American history as this, it becomes a nation of the enthusiastic citizens, the ambivalent citizens, and the unwilling people. So I mean, the country, I don't think it's appropriate to take this kind of nation of immigrant approach, because it does minimize the experiences of Native Americans and African descended people. So I think this idea of a coalition of people who have varying commitments to the nation itself and varying benefits or lack thereof from being associated with the nation is beneficial. And I guess one benefit of writing a book like this is that you can pick certain themes like education and see how truly you can discuss it from this much more multivalent perspective. Because, sometimes in these surveys, when we try to talk about diversity, it can become siloed. But in reality, these are people who are living and working and fighting closely together. So I think like looking at some of these issues that bring people together or drive them apart can be really illuminating.
All right. Well, thank you. Any last questions before we wrap up? Checking. I want to say thank you very much, Dr. Snyder, for being here with us. This has been really fascinating. And we hope you all enjoyed joining us tonight for this webinar. If you are looking for something fun to do tomorrow evening, speaking of sort of networks and this Atlantic world approach, tomorrow evening's webinar, same time, 7:30 Eastern, we'll look at navigating transatlantic networks. Insights into human history with Professor Jorge Felipe Gonzalez at the University of Texas, San Antonio. So we will continue these themes. Thank you again so much, Dr. Snyder.
Thank you so much. Thanks for your questions and for joining me tonight. I appreciate it.
Thanks, everyone.